Um, Ukraine has made some really important steps in the last year. It started to increase its gas prices by about 3 to 4-fold. This has started to reduce the demand in Ukraine, and it allowed to decrease the deficit of the Ukrainian government a lot, which is an important sign after 20 years of stagnation on that front. In addition, a new management team came into the Ukrainian government in the gas sector. So we have young people, a young minister of about 40 years, we have a regulator that is in his 20s, we have a head of the gas company that is around 40. They are all coming from a business background, and they are bringing in new management methods and much more transparency and openness. So ideas are now discussed between the different branches of the sector. Openly one can enter into debates. So this is really good news. And in addition, also thanks to the European Union, it has now been able that Ukraine imports much more gas from the West than from Russia. So it might be that Ukraine already today is essentially independent from imports of Russian gas, which is very important for the country, not only for the day-to-day business, but also for development of their gas sector, because now Russia cannot block Ukraine anymore from conducting the reforms that it has in mind. On the other hand, there's a number of challenges ahead for the Ukrainian gas sector still. So we see that there is still a highly complex gas company with about 80,000 people that is very difficult to reform. So Naftogaz is doing all the gas sector activities in Ukraine, and it will require quite a lot of political capital to make that into something sensible. In addition to that, obviously different interest groups are entering the game and trying to draw the development in a situation that is helpful for them. They are also relying on different outside support for their individual ideas. So there is a risk that the restructuring in the end gets stuck in the internal political fights, and here the European Union might be helpful. In addition, there is a new risk arising for Ukraine. Ukraine currently makes revenues of about 2 billion from gas transit. And if the gas pipeline through the Baltic Sea, the Nord Stream pipeline, will be finalized by 2019, that might mean that those revenues will fall away, which is a problem for Ukraine. Which is more problematic is the political signal that the European Union is sending with that. It's essentially saying to the Ukrainians, look, you trust us, but we don't trust you. And I think that's a very difficult thing if you want to engage into deep reforms of the Ukrainian gas sector. The Energy Union initiative was developed last year, and the idea of it was to come up with 5 different pillars of energy policy at the European level. And I think this was a very smart move by the European Commission, because it allowed each and every member state to see an individual benefit in the initiative. So Poland, for example, might be very interested in a more Europeanization of gas security of supply, which means that then Poland could rely on the solidarity from Germany. It might be supported in case Russia stops gas supplies. So there would be a big benefit for Poland for more Europeanization in terms of gas security of supply. Germany currently might have troubles with its renewable deployment, because if the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, it needs all its neighbors to export the excess electricity. But if the neighbors do not want this electricity, it is a burden for the German Energiewende. So in terms of renewables, Germany has to gain something from closer cooperation with its neighbors. France has a power plant park that relies heavily on nuclear electricity, which has very low carbon emissions, which means that a very high price on CO2 is increasing the electricity price, but not the cost of producing electricity in France, which is very nice for the French industry. So it makes French companies, or especially EDF, richer. So France would have something to gain from high carbon prices. So if you take those three dimensions together, and there are two more, and I could name other countries that would benefit from other things, you see that everybody has to gain something from closer collaboration, but obviously everybody also has to give something. So in terms of carbon, Poland would not be very keen to let it loose on its coal industry, so higher carbon prices are a burden for Poland, but I guess Poland values security of supply higher. In terms of renewables, the neighboring countries of Germany do not like all this cheap electricity that's flowing into their system and destroying the economy of their systems. But still, France might get the carbon price and Poland the higher security of supply. So everybody gives something, everybody obtains something in return that is more valuable. So therefore, this idea of the energy union to set out 5 different dimensions and to discuss this not at the level of the ministers of energy, which are deeply entrenched into their political systems and which are kind of very prone to the lobbying of their national incumbents, but at the level of the heads of state, which might allow really a big horse trading because the large ideas is, I think, a brilliant term. Whether this will work in the end and result in a substantial reintegration of European energy policy, or whether the trend of renationalization that we observed in the past decade will continue nevertheless, is the big question for the coming year, essentially. It's more on the, so I would really make the distinction between national and European level. Regional level is a difficult term in the European Union, because regional can be understood as several countries or as sub-regions of a country. There's a lot of discussion in the European Union currently about regional integration, so that neighboring countries work together more closely. I am a bit reluctant to call for such regional initiatives, because in my view, the big questions of the time, like renewable integration, like security of supply, like carbon markets, cannot be answered by neighboring countries alone. You want, for renewables, for example, to make sure that if the wind is not blowing in the North Sea region, which is a lot of countries, but the wind stops blowing at the same time in all those countries, that you then can get the electricity from the solar plants in Italy, or from the wind turbines in the Atlantic basin, like Spain and Portugal. The same for security of supply. If you have all the Central East European countries sitting together in a regional bloc, but if Russia decides to cut their gas supply, they are all in the same problem, so they cannot help each other out. I'm quite optimistic. I think it is really a breakthrough, because it essentially reignites momentum. So after the failure of Copenhagen, there was a worry that the countries of the world will not be able to come together, and everybody is blaming the neighboring or the other countries for not doing something, and therefore not being able to conduct decarbonization in his home country. So this deadlock is essentially broken with the high-level commitment from the heads of state of those 195 countries that convened in Paris. I think there are 4 reasons to be optimistic. The first one is we see here a move away from a protocol to an architecture. A protocol is a one-shot thing where everybody sits together and solves the problem for all time. And that was doomed to fail. That did not work very well in Kyoto, and it did not work at all in Copenhagen. So the new idea is to have an architecture which turns the whole climate negotiation process into a repeated game. So everybody will see everybody else again in 5 years and will look into their delivery on their past commitments and about the tightening of their future commitments. And this repeated game generates trust and really generates for me the hope that, that there will be enough naming and shaming and loss of political capital if you're not delivering that really brings forward the decarbonization to the level we need. The second thing that I see is the move from top-down approaches that we had before to a bottom-up approach. Before, the idea was we have a carbon budget on a global level, so a certain amount of CO2 or greenhouse gases that can be emitted, and that needs to be distributed among all the countries participating in an agreement. But this is an impossible task, because if I want to emit something more, somebody else has to emit something less, so it becomes a zero-sum game, and a zero-sum game with 195 parties has no practical solution. So the new approach, everybody is pledging something, and over time it's tightened, seems much more politically realistic, and it essentially managed to break the deadlock of the Kyoto Protocol. The third item that I think is important in the Paris Agreement is the move away from just committing the developed countries. You have to see that in the Kyoto Protocol, the OECD countries, the developed countries, were emitting about half of the global greenhouse gases. That was in 1997. Now they are emitting only about a third. So 2/3 of the emissions come from outside the developed countries. And the Paris Agreement, for the first time, manages to put also obligations, constraining obligations, on all parties, not only the developed countries, which, looking forward, is becoming increasingly important because the share of the not developed countries in the global emissions is not stopping at 2/3, it will increase in the future. And the final point that is important in the Paris Agreement is that it ignites momentum. So we have had a period of time in which we were really unsure on where all this decarbonization will go. Industry, fossil fuel industry told us, we cannot do anything here, we will lose competitiveness vis-à-vis the others, so therefore we have to wait for an international agreement, and an international agreement will never come, so let's just build higher dams and try to see how climate change is, maybe it's not so bad after all. And that was really nurturing doubt in the heads of policymakers whether it's a good idea to invest heavily into decarbonization. Now those doubts should have vanished, at least to some degree, and now policymakers can really start to conduct meaningful and efficient decarbonization policies in their countries. Because, just to give an example, the European emission trading system has had a hard time in the last years also because of a lot of compensations for loss of competitiveness given to the individual companies. So efficient policies were not being able to be efficient simply because of the fear of the loss of competitiveness, because the others don't manage to do that. Now we can do those efficient decarbonization policies instead of the maybe less efficient decarbonization policies we actually conducted. We deployed a lot of wind turbines and solar panels that were extremely expensive and might not have delivered enough carbon reductions for the money than we would have seen with higher carbon prices. So here I'm quite optimistic that essentially the Paris Agreement enables us to strengthen the good policies and phase down a bit the less good policies.